Afternoon, everyone, or depending on where you are sitting, perhaps good morning. My name is Allison Wood. I am a partner at McGuireWoods, and I am very excited to have you all participate in today's webinar, which is entitled ESG, Current Pressures, Trends, and the Mysteries of Ratings. We are going to be covering 3 topics today. I'm going to be leading off by talking about what are the pressures that companies are facing on the ESG front, with the intention of teeing up the discussion by my 2 co-presenters, Svec and Steph Weiler from Alvarez and Marsal. Vic is going to talk about what are the current trends that he's seeing in ESG. And then Steph is going to talk about, I know, a topic that is very important to many, many companies, which is ESG ratings. She is a guru at those and can talk about how they work and how she assists companies with their ratings. The speakers today, I am really honored to be co-presenting with Vic and Steph today. Not only are they really accomplished on the ESG front, but they're also just fabulous people. Vic is a managing director with Alvarez and Marsal in their Chicago office. He specializes in ESG strategy and improvement initiatives. For more than 3 decades, he has corporate experience in investor relations, social responsibility and ESG, and corporate communications, representing Fortune 500 companies and global category leaders in the energy, consumer products, and recreation sectors. Steph is also a managing director at Alvarez and Marsal in their ESG services practice. She specializes in ESG analysis, strategy, integration, and communications. She has more than 14 years of corporate experience across ESG, investor relations, and corporate communications in the energy sector, and she brings extensive expertise in ESG disclosure, frameworks, and, as you all know, rating services, because that's what she's going to be talking about today. I, Allison Wood, am, as I said, a partner at McGuireWoods. I lead the firm's ESG Task Force. We call our practice a task force because ESG encompasses so many different practice areas, and we pride ourselves on having specialists in all the multitude of areas. My area of expertise is in environmental law, and where I'm particularly known is in the area of climate change. And I have been practicing as a climate change attorney for more than 20 years. I have helped clients in defending them on climate change nuisance suits. I have been involved in every Clean Air Act rulemaking under climate change, including representing clients before the Supreme Court on these issues, and also testifying before Congress on these issues. At the end of the slide deck, you'll see some summaries of what Alvarez and Marsal and what McGuireWoods can do on the ESG front. We're not going to go through those, but they are there. Our slides will be available on the McGuireWoods website after the webinar ends, along with a recording of this webinar. So if you think that a colleague maybe would appreciate what we're talking about, you can always send them to the website to watch it. Or if you're thinking, I would really like those slides, you'll be able to go there and download them. Throughout the presentation, you can ask questions at any time. There's a little Q&A box, and we will be monitoring it. Where appropriate, we might ask the question right away, but we are planning on leaving time at the end dedicated to questions. You don't have to wait till then. If for some reason we do not get to your question, we do save them, and we will then email you. One of us will email you a response. So you will get an answer, if not live, then later on by email. So pressures of ESG. I think everyone is probably feeling these and, is familiar. Just want to make clear that, our ESG services span all of the different range of ESG services you might need. And one of the things we really pride ourselves on as a firm is we can take someone who doesn't have any ESG program at all and just wants to start from basics all the way to people who have very sophisticated ones. And, we're here and happy to help. So ESG is a fairly new concept, but one that has been gaining a lot of attention in recent years. It really started out as sustainability, 10, 15 years ago, then moving toward an emphasis on climate. But now it has grown to encompass a much broader array of things. So in addition to the environmental focus, which again is primarily focused on climate and is why you have me sitting here talking about it, but there is also the S and G components that are becoming more and more important. So on the S social side, you can see companies having to grapple with issues like fair pay or executive compensation or child labor, LGBTQ issues. And ever since the Dodd's decision about exactly a year ago, that's the abortion case that came out of the Supreme Court, you're seeing more and more companies having to grapple with reproductive rights. On the governance side, the G, you see a lot of pressure on things like what a company discloses. The SEC has, proposed a very comprehensive sweeping rule last year that would require a huge amount of disclosure on things like climate that has not been finalized at this time, but is expected to be finalized soon and will have a huge impact on any publicly traded company. You also see governance issues like what is the composition of the officers in a company? Is it diverse? Same with their board of directors. Do you have women? Do you have diverse individuals serving on it? So it can encompass a lot of things. The E piece is probably the one that is the most developed. And you see lots of pressure on that for companies to be doing things like setting goals or targets to be carbon neutral by certain years. And now what you're starting to see is some pushback on those goals that companies set. So, for example, in the past month, there was a lawsuit filed against a major airline that accused them of calling themselves the world's first carbon neutral airline, and the way they were basing that off of, they were using carbon offsets. The lawsuit, though, says that the carbon offsets that they're relying on aren't of appropriate or good quality. So it's not, so we're moving away from not just being able to show that you're carbon neutral. Now it seems that you have to show you're appropriately carbon neutral. So it's constantly evolving and moving in new and different ways. And you're having to answer to lots of disparate voices. So you have demands from investors, demands from consumers, demands from advocacy groups. And these demands are increasingly driving and affecting companies in many, many ways. So for example, you have investors that are saying that they will not invest in or will divest in shares in companies that aren't disclosing enough data with regard to what they're doing on the ESG front. And you're having lenders being pressured not to loan to certain types of companies. The ones that always pop up when this is coming up in the ESG context are fossil fuel companies or firearms companies are ones that tend to attract that attention. So the investors are pushing on for no further investments, definitely in coal. But honestly, that has grown to also encompass now oil and gas. Pretty much any fossil fuel investment may be questioned. The emphasis is on renewable energy, low carbon, and ESG investments. And they're really trying to secure these board commitments to climate action. Now, I just gave you an example of a major airline that had made such a commitment and is now facing a greenwashing lawsuit. So it's a definite tightrope that companies have to walk. So you make these commitments, you make these pledges, you set these goals, but then you have to be careful, not to then set yourself up for a lawsuit that might accuse you of not meeting those goals appropriately. It's a minefield. Shareholder proposals are also something that companies are increasingly having to deal with, and they are increasing year after year after year. So in 2022, last year, it was a record-breaking year for ESG-related proposals. There were 627 of them, but as of mid-February of this year, there were already 542 ESG-related proposals. So you can see that it's already on track to beat last year's record-breaking year. The bulk of these shareholder resolutions involve climate change issues, most of them. However, following the Dobbs decision, there has been an increased focus on shareholder proposals on reproductive health issues. And we are also now seeing the rise of anti-ESG proposals, making it a further landmine for companies and for the most part, really putting companies in between a rock and a hard place, where companies are needing to negotiate between, if you're a company that is in multiple states, you might have some states that really want you to be involved on ESG measures. You could be in other states that have an anti-ESG bent and are pushing against ESG measures, and perhaps even punishing companies for being too focused on ESG. And really what's happened here is the issue has become very political and politicized, where ESG is now being equated with being woke. And you can see here on the slide a bunch of headlines that I found that show this anti-ESG movement. You can see Texas versus big banks. You can see investors then pushing back against the anti-ESG political attacks. You can see, I think everyone is aware of the battle between Disney and the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, over ESG issues. So 16 states have passed legislation this year that restricts the ESG strategy that screens for things like ESG risks. And so in those 16 states, you're not allowed to be looking at ESG factors in your investment decisions, in things like public pension funds. These anti-ESG movement legislation can range from things like restricting public pension funds from using ESG principles, saying that insurers can't use them, refusing in some states to permit renewable energy products, refusing to have state government contracts with any financial firms that boycott investments in fossil fuels or firearms. And indeed, the very first veto that President Biden ever did was earlier this year, and it was on an anti-ESG investment law that had passed that he vetoed. So with that, what I'm trying to do is set the table, and I am going to pass the baton to Vic to then talk about what are the trends in the face of all this pressure.
Well, thanks for that, Allison, and great to be here today. And Allison, if we could keep the mic with you just for a second, we did have a question around how ethics interplays with the concept of ESG. If you wanted to touch on that for a moment.
Yeah, I think ethics definitely do factor in. It's a big piece of the S. Well, actually, I could argue that ethics is a part of all three. So let me do that. On the E side, environment, some people would say we have an ethical and a moral responsibility to the planet and to future generations to be doing something about climate change. That's an ethical issue. Some people on the social side, same thing. We have an ethical obligation to ensure that people are paid fairly, that children aren't being forced into labor, and that we're not promoting those sorts of things. On the governance side, we have an obligation to ensure that everyone has, equal access to the information that they need in investing, and that diverse companies are, give a broader perspective than non-diverse ones. All of those can be considered ethical issues. Some of the anti-ESG movement rejects that and says companies shouldn't be engaged in these issues, that what companies are designed to do, to be quite blunt, in a capitalistic society is make money. And that is what should drive your decisions, making money, not these more social and moral obligations. Vic, I think you're muted.
Thanks for that. I think the G, in fact, is really housed quite a bit around ethics consideration. And it wasn't just the advent of ESG that had companies put into place code of business conduct for their employees, for their contractors, and these days for suppliers as well. That's good sort of traditional law and order kind of aspects of things. I also feel like safety, cybersecurity, to your point, Allison, not being in favor of child labor. These are hardly radical concepts, but certainly they come into that broad smorgasbord that we tend to call ESG or sustainability or social responsibility. And so I think to some extent, we're seeing maybe a natural correction in the world these days based on ESG coming pretty far, pretty fast, but that correction does not mean that we're necessarily putting the toothpaste back in the tube on all of those components.
I definitely think that there are pieces, Vic, that are non-controversial, and the easiest one I think is child labor. I've never met a company or worked for a company that somehow thought that was okay. So, I do think it's important to remember that pieces of ESG aren't controversial while other pieces are.
Yeah, and I would also argue that there's a little bit of a false or straw man, if you will, argument around what companies should be focused on, because to me, a successful company is always going to look at maximizing shareholder returns. One of the ways to do that is to focus on keeping their stakeholders in as nice of a blend of contentment as possible. And that's really at the heart of ESG as well. So, and it's an excellent segue, Allison, into a discussion of 5 trends that in our view are really driving sustainability and ESG or business responsibility or CSR, whatever you may choose to call it there. And the first one really is an extension of what Allison was just talking about, which is that there are pressures. We see them really from probably 5 or 6 different places, and Allison did a great job of covering those. What's interesting to me is just in the last couple of years, it does seem as though regulatory pressures and customer pressures are beginning to eclipse the investor push. I won't steal Stephanie's thunder, but she'll tell you about EcoVadis, which is probably a 10x in terms of the number of companies they rate, greater than ISS, which we all know from being in the public company realm, rating companies on their proxy proposals and other kind of ESG type of elements there. So the anti-ESG movement may be, frankly, a useful correction right now. But we also, and I have this conversation with oil and gas operators, which is to say that if you are providing access to low-cost energy and expanded affordability, then there's an S story there for you to own from a narrative perspective. So there's no need to necessarily come out trying to howl at the moon and argue against something that does seem to be a secular macro trend there. But there are ways to really say, look, we provide affordable energy for the masses, and we do that in a way where we're trying to make our emissions better every day, for instance, just to use one example in that space. The second one, from a trend perspective, is that carbon really does remain the big dog out there. And Allison alluded to it, climate change, climate risk, decarbonization activities, literally been going on now for 30 years as a topic, and likely will be going on at least 30 years more. It really is its own, not even cottage industry, but macro trend out there that will remain so for quite some time. But there are some tweaks to that, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. On the other hand, supply chain is, I've sort of cutely called it a 400-pound gorilla, probably quickly growing as time goes by. Supply chain ESG probably is only about in the second or third inning, I would say, to use a baseball analog. And that's because supply chains increasingly are being called on to grapple with supply chain managers, to grapple with decarbonization, ethical sourcing, a host of other kind of elements, and we'll dig into that just a little bit. We alluded to this a few minutes ago, but there's no reason to break down into a debate over what the value of ESG is for a company. It's fine to say that ESG is around creating tangible business value, even from an income statement, balance sheet, other kind of purposes. And if you want, you can consider saving the planet as a co-benefit. I particularly like being able to spend my days in a way that is a nice blend of, if you will, traditional nonprofit kind of activities, yet helping a company be more profitable as a result of using all of those tools that typically perhaps were overlooked there. Companies may be squandering sustainability if they're only looking at it through a cost center lens. And we'll talk a little bit more about an example there, walking down the income statement and showing where ESG can be a tangible value creator from a financial perspective, even as we note saving the planet might be a co-benefit. And then finally, to turn the corner, I won't be focusing on this, but I will say that Steph has this teed up well. ESG ratings, they're horribly flawed right now, and there's some egregious examples out there of ratings not being updated, of them being in gross error state, but they also, in many cases, are shaping behavior among a variety of stakeholder groups, particularly customers, consumers, investors, lenders, and others there. So let's dig into a couple of these in just a little bit more data. So I mentioned EcoVadis. EcoVadis rates literally tens of thousands of companies. It is a large organization that essentially rates the suppliers for large customers primarily. And they've taken a look at where customers are looking at their supply chain and which of those suppliers are at various stages on what they call scope 3, which is really the supply chain and customer aspect of carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And take a look at this, and this is why I say we're in such early innings. Only 3% of companies are considered either advanced or leaders in this from their survey. And in fact, 83% are either insufficient or beginners in climate action. If you haven't focused much on scope 3, you will be in a bigger way. That's because as we look at those regulatory pressures, you've got the SEC considering scope 3, and that's in their draft proposal, whether or not it makes it into the final. You've got the state of California, where there's a bill moving through past the Senate in the General Assembly right now that require mid to larger size companies to report out on scope 3. You've got the European Union, which is requiring it, and IFRS, which covers the vast majority of countries around the world on their accounting standards, also in this area. So scope 3 and supply chain greenhouse gas emissions rapidly growing as a major trend out there. And watch this space in coming years for additional info on that. While we're in the supply chain area, I'll dig down a little bit more into sustainable sourcing, because just like ethics in our Q&A that came in a few minutes ago, the supply chain aspect of the world really does encompass all three aspects of ESG. We talked a moment ago about decarbonization. The other area, frankly, within supply chain managers' purview is buying electricity and fuel. And the ability to reduce emissions is so well connected to a company's efficiency and the ability to reduce energy use that it will increasingly come under scrutiny as time goes by. Within the social area, here we're talking about ethical sourcing. We mentioned forced labor, child labor, but also really consider whether your products are coming from areas of conflict minerals, whether you trace things back all the way to the source. The EU is passing legislation and regulation around what they're calling a digital product passport, which increasingly will allow you to X-ray, if you will, a product at the store on the shelf to be able to tell where those ingredients came from all the way back to its source, as well as the packaging itself. So that will receive a variety of attention over time. There's all kinds of fascinating work going on traceability of products, which allow you to say whether your cotton came from Xinjiang and likely was produced using forced labor. There's DNA testing. There's country-specific risk analyses from a security standpoint, from an ethics standpoint. So a really meaty area for people to look into as increasingly consumers and business customers want to know where their products are coming from. And then finally, on the governance side, we do see growing supplier expectations being built up around ESG. That includes codes of conduct, it includes RFPs and requests for information. It's getting built into contracts there. There are audits going on with suppliers, both main tier and deeper. It's an area too that will have increasing scrutiny as time goes by. My dog apparently wants to get into the act, so we appreciate his enthusiasm for the presentation today. So increasingly, we are seeing that ESG is a tangible creator of value. And just to walk down a couple of highlights of the income statement, first of all, we're seeing it on the revenue line item. And this comes in a few forms. Steph will give an example in a moment of preserving revenues associated with good ESG scores and minimum standards out there. We're also seeing, and I'll cover it more in just a second, companies begin to reshape their portfolio and look at their revenue base around sustainability differentiation as a customer value proposition. On the cost of good line item, if you're improving efficiency, if you're lowering energy use, you are improving your cost line item. Frankly, what are you also doing? And this is also true if you're reshoring, you're probably reducing your supply chain, you're reducing emissions. So these co-benefits shouldn't be ignored. In fact, they should really be leveraged and maximized to the extent possible. Sustainability-linked loans and bonds are another area on the income statement where you've got tangible value. We work with companies that have literally hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in debt, and the ability to save, call it 50 basis points if they meet certain ESG-linked loans. These are increasingly popular. Any company can do that. These are not green bonds only for renewable companies, but these are sustainability-linked loans associated with continuous improvement across the ESG space. And then finally, the income tax line item. We've seen the CHIPS bill, the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act have a tsunami of incentives, of grants, of other kind of components to be able to create tax value even while you're driving value elsewhere along the chain in that area. And then finally, for my section, I just wanted to emphasize for a moment that ESG is increasingly being used by companies across their portfolio, across their various approach to capital planning, to investments, to customer value proposition kind of aspects. And here are a few learnings that we've taken from our work with clients on this front. The first is to really look at ways to align sustainability themes with the macro top-line drivers of your business. Think about decarbonization. Think of circular economy and supply chain. That can drive top-line growth. It also can give you an expanded multiple. What's an extra half turn of EV to EBITDA multiple or 2 turns of price earnings multiple worth to your shareholders on that front? Because that's what good ESG performers can attain versus those poor kind of bottom quintile performers. You need to carefully match the pace and direction of demand trends. The market direction and timing of market shifts can be very tricky to try to pin down. And, we work with companies in mobility, with convenience store companies, with truck store chains. Getting the timing and investment right around things like charging stations is important. You could be 5 years ahead of the curve and have some dead capital there for some time frame, or you could be you could miss the market and have your competitors eat your market share on that. So an interesting conundrum, but definitely one to be carefully heeding. Also, take a look at what your customers are doing versus what they say. Hamilton might have said it's important to be in the room where it happens. Well, Here you want to be in the room where things are being discussed by your customers. Yes, they may talk a good game on sustainability. What are they actually investing in? What matters to them the most? Having that strong connectivity with your customers is very important. It's number 4, emphasizing flexible investments for modular emerging tech. This is really around cost and risk sharing, which is important for any company to avoid concentration risk of investments, just as we would as individual investors, and also to avoid that build it and they will come kind of bet the farm approaches, which can be risky really in any area. But with some of the key emerging energy transition and other kinds of technologies, it's a good way to spread the risk and spread the reward as you're proving out concepts on that. Number 5, structuring innovation around sustainability weighted CapEx. This is really an interesting one, but if you are a company that is likely heading toward a future in which carbon is being capped and a price is being put on it, then now is probably a good time to say, I should be thinking about a toggle at the very least on my capital expenditure forms to say, where is my investment going, not only in a steady state current environment, but in a world where there is a price on carbon out there. So being able to say, is this investment in equipment still favorable over the next 10 to 15 years in a world where the price on CO2 might be $100 per ton equivalent is key there. Number 6, you want to take steps to de-risk new investments with customer allies. This is a little bit of a play off of number 3 as well, which is being able to spread those risks and note where customers really are putting down their chips on that. And then finally, number 7, incorporating the cost of carbon into your internal ROI calcs. That's something that we're also seeing, as well as portfolio kind of decisions that are being made around macro trends that continue to encourage decarbonization over time. You know, it's interesting. We're seeing a world in which, as we approach 2030, for instance, no one knows what is going to happen to the price of carbon, the price of renewable energy credits out there, but it may well spike to the upside, creating risk for companies that are going to be reliant on the credit markets to achieve their goals around 2030. So a few trends, particularly around the use of innovation around sustainability as a customer value proposition. Finally, just a little bit of an advertisement on A&M ESG services. We do have 3 different areas that we key on. Won't dwell on these, but it's around transaction advisory, ESG, and EHS due diligence. It's around ESG strategy and implementation, and then, of course, decarbonization and climate risk. And with that, happy to hand things over to Steph Weiler.
Thanks, Svec. So today, rather than going through individual methodologies for the host of ESG ratings, we thought we'd just offer a few of the quick facts for how to address the ratings. Number 1, we've already touched on this, but the ratings are no longer just for investors. I think that that's how everyone views the ESG ratings. It's really meant for the investor lens and how do we, attract new capital. That's not the case anymore. More often than not, we're seeing customers really diving into this space and using the ratings as a means to evaluate their supply chain, their suppliers, and stacking those suppliers against each other for who they want to do future business with. Number 2, this is really around the disclosure aspect of it. So make the ESG information that you have, make your disclosures very accessible. I think often we tend to tuck ESG into about 3 layers down on our websites or perhaps in broader reports that are put out. Make sure that the information can be found, particularly by the raters. They're using web crawlers, they're using analysts to find this information. Don't make them go digging for it because they probably won't. Number 3, often we see that I put out my ESG report. I've published some information on my website. Why is my rating not improving? Enhanced disclosure does not automatically translate to ratings improvement. And we see this over and over again. And we're going to talk more on why that is and what to do about it. Number 4, industry classification is a challenge, but not an excuse to ignore ratings. Very often we have clients that are saying, you know what, I'm not even going to worry about the ratings. I'm in an industry, the ratings don't favor. I can never do well on that. That's never the case. Every company can do incrementally better really across the E, S, and G space. But even if you don't have, let's say, a net zero goal out there, that doesn't mean that you can't exceed in other areas like the S or the G. So make sure that you're still paying attention to the ratings. You don't have to cover every aspect or get an A+ in every single way, but you can make meaningful improvements through your disclosure and through your long-term performance improvements. And the last piece of this is that, and I really can't emphasize this enough, but don't use the ratings as a way to drive your ESG strategy. They should inform it. You can align KPIs to the ratings to make sure that you're getting the most credit. You can look at how you can enhance your disclosures over time, but don't let that drive an ESG strategy. You're probably going to become exhausted with the process if you're constantly chasing a ratings, and it's really not providing the value, as Vic had mentioned, to your longer term business strategy. ESG strategy, business strategy should be aligned in many ways. And if you're only looking at this through a ratings lens, you're never going to achieve that. So with that, let's talk in a bit more detail about some of these areas. The first is really around this customer pressure. So Vic had mentioned this earlier, but when we look at the ratings universe, it's pretty incredible to see the ISSs of the world, the MSCIs, those that we're familiar with in the ratings space. They're covering only a fraction in terms of the companies under their coverage universe. EcoVadis is looking at over 100,000 companies today, and that's because of this supply chain push. Everyone is starting to look into their supply chains. They're wanting to understand performance. They're wanting to understand disclosures and make sure that those disclosures actually are matching up with that performance. So they're going to third-party services like EcoVadis to do that ratings work for them. And what we're finding is that it's not just a benchmark in some ways to say, oh, how do you perform against other suppliers within our lineup, but they're actually using those scores to preclude certain companies from working with them. So this is a good example of a client that we had worked with, but essentially when they started this process, the score was a 30 out of 100 overall for EcoVadis. That score was below the threshold that they wanted for all of their suppliers. So essentially, we went through the process. We took a year to upgrade everything in terms of disclosure, in terms of performance. We started tracking metrics, but got that score to a 45. There's still much more room for improvement, but as we know, these programs take time. But essentially that score, getting it to a 45, preserved $3 million per month in revenues. And those are just the known revenues. That's not revenues that are attached to others who are just starting to look at using this particular supplier. So there's real money, real dollars that are being attached to these scores. Number 2 is around the placement. Again, make it easy for the raters to find this information. When you're looking at thousands of companies, things are going to be missed, but you can make it easier for them to find it. So always encourage, if at very least put a tab at the top of your web page. If you're not comfortable having a separate ESG, sustainability, corporate social responsibility tab, put it in the About section. So at least it's only one drop down below that. Once you're on that dedicated web page, make sure that you have good links through to either other pages where information can be found or to reports and policy disclosures. So you can see the example that we have here, human rights policies, put it out on the website, vendor code of conduct, standard business code of conduct. Make sure that you have those easily linked to in PDF form or to other areas of your website where they may already exist, but it's important to have it on that dedicated front. And then finally, use ESG reports, particularly the appendix section. I think a lot of these raters are jumping toward the appendix to look through what you may have already aligned to from GRI, SASB, TCFD. Use that appendix, link back to policies, to statements, to approaches that you have living on a regular update on your website, but make sure that it's all cross-linked so that it's very accessible for these raters to find. Let's talk a little bit about the disclosure and performance versus engagement. Again, we see that very often you put out the disclosure and you think my ratings should reflect that within a week. Ratings are often lagging disclosure by 2 to 3 years. So if you put out your ESG report in June of 2023, it might be June of 2025 before you actually see the improvement reflected from that report. So this is where the engagement piece becomes incredibly important for companies. So first we start with make sure you understand the methodologies and the update process. So I say that because it's not just about how the ratings are constructed, but when are they updating? Some raters have great user-friendly portals that you can go on and update the information yourself. Others are sending out an email in a response to a survey that you need to interact with. That email may be going to a location or an account that no longer exists. It might be a person that left the company, 2 years ago. So make sure that you have the right contact information in there. If there is an annual survey or a quarterly survey that's being used, make sure that you're responding to that in a way that makes sense, but know how it's being updated. Again, we know that these disclosures, they're not going to be uniform. Not every company is going to put them in the same place. So these raters are going to miss the information. So even with that prominent placement, it's not a guarantee that they're going to find the information. So when those disclosures are missed, that's when you really need to start that direct outreach. So this is not a time to be modest. Make sure you're stating the obvious. If you're against, forced labor, make sure you're stating it in a policy, put it on the website, and then let the raters know that it's out there. Again, if you're taking a good approach or a meaningful approach to the environment, to safety, to your employee base, make sure that you're getting credit for those activities. And this last piece, I think that this is usually where companies kind of stop. So we've let them know that we have disclosure out there. That should be good enough. We've done our diligence in that way. This last piece is you don't have to just take whatever answer they give you. So often you're going to get a canned response back from some of the raters say we can't accept this answer. It doesn't meet our criteria for awarding points. That is not always the case. Sometimes there's not a true understanding of your business or how you conduct your business. Oftentimes the responses can be very vague. If you feel that response is not adequate, if you feel that you have a good approach, a good policy, and you should be awarded credit, fight for that policy. And that's when you can engage with an analyst. If you're not comfortable doing that, there's third parties like an A&M that can go out and help fight that battle for you and make the case for why it should be. This is just an example down below for making that case. Identify the question, let them know what the current response is, what you think the updated response should be, link and identify where they can find that information. So if it's an approach to human rights, link out to it. If it's a code of conduct, make sure you're identifying even what page that's on. Make it very, very easy for them not to miss it and not give you credit. So I just want to point to this case study, but we were working with a company, and after we started reviewing a few of their ratings criteria, one rater in particular on a, call it 100-point questionnaire, they had missed 30% of the public disclosures that this company was offering. So these were not disclosures that were hidden. They were very prominent on the website. They had been there for years, and the raters still were not capturing it. So simply by engaging with those raters, letting them know that the information is where it is, letting them know that it exists, we were able to get that score up from a CCC to a BBB. Number 4, this is really recognizing individual strengths of companies and playing to those strengths, and then also being aware of where your industry peers stand. So when we start to look through this, we've noticed that ratings are very often reflective of peer performance. So it's relative to how your peers are performing. You want to make sure you're in the right classification. I can't tell you how many times we've worked with companies where we have mining companies that are being identified as a real estate company. If you're a coal company in this instance, perhaps you're being grouped in with the broader metals and mining universe. That is going to reflect in your relative performance. So make sure you're in the right classification. Make sure that that questionnaire is reflective of your industry and fight for it. Raters are often reluctant to change that classification, but you can engage with them. Again, make your case for why you should be included in a different classification. The next point is often, ratings for areas, make sure you're looking at those ratings where there's inconsistencies. So if we're looking at the bottom section down here for company A, innovation and product responsibility, there's zeros in those categories. If you know that you have disclosure on those areas, if you feel that you have good approaches that are out there, make sure you're letting those raters know. And it can become very apparent on these rating score sheets very quickly when things are simply missed. So if something doesn't feel right, just on initial glance, make sure that you're digging in a bit more and understanding why. I would also suggest you look at the relative performance as well. For instance, under workforce, if you're ranked an 18 and you have a direct peer that is a 46, you probably know a little bit about that peer. What are they doing that's different? Or perhaps they're not doing anything different than you. You just haven't been disclosing in a meaningful way. So conducting those benchmarking activities can be incredibly helpful to evaluating your own score and paths to improve it. I'll give you an example here of an oil and gas services company that we were working with, and they happened to be getting zeros in both innovation and product responsibility. That didn't sit well. Their entire business was based on improving GHG emissions for operations for their customers. It didn't feel right. There was clearly something that was not, the wires weren't being connected with the raters. So after some engagement, some detailed engagement, making the case, making sure that everything was prominent on the website, those scores in each of those categories improved to an 86 out of 100. So substantial improvement. Again, this was just their business. This isn't something that they had to do differently. This was just making sure that they had the right disclosures and were engaging with the raters in a meaningful way. And the last point I wanted to just emphasize is around broader ESG strategy. Again, ratings should not be driving your ESG strategy. Your ESG strategy is about making sure that you're enhancing your business strategy, enhancing the value of your company over time. So if you take even a materiality approach to it, line it up in terms of broad categories. Say what's important to our company, what's important to each of our stakeholders, and then use that third column perhaps for your ratings providers. Zero in on those key raters. You don't have to go through every single rater in this instance. I would say to focus on those that are meaningful to your stakeholders first. Focus on those, understand what they're asking for, what are their KPIs, and does that tie back to what you're already addressing? So you can see areas of commonality even across the checkbox here that says, okay, we should be getting some incremental credit for climate risk management. We should be getting some incremental credit for citizenship and philanthropy. Make sure that these areas are prominent on your website. Make sure that you're disclosing them in an appropriate way and making sure that you're engaging with those ratings providers to see that that's reflected in your scoring.
Hey, Steph.
Yes.
There was a good question that just came in that's relevant to what you're talking about. The person wanted to know whether raters provide a preview of your ratings, or do you only have a chance to see them once they're issued? And if it's the latter, how long does it take to get them corrected or updated?
So it depends. Most of the raters, I will say, they issue the rating, and oftentimes companies don't even know that they've been rated. So when that ratings is issued, it might be based on simply the disclosure that's been available, let's say on your website or within your ESG report. Once that rating is made, then you can often go in and engage. And again, this goes to the individual methodologies and update process for each of the raters. Some will give you access to a client portal, which makes it very easy for you to interact with the rater and provide updates. I will say an ISS, for instance, if you have access to that client portal, you can see a ratings update, at least for individual indicators. That can be done within, a 48-hour to a week period. So it's very quick. Other raters have a lot longer lead time. And I will say, even within ISS, something like a corporate rating, that may only be updated every year or every 2 years. So you need to know and not miss the timing for those. But I will say more often than not, you're given the rating and then you have the chance to make the update. A few modifications maybe to that. So something like an EcoVadis, that you do have the opportunity. You will go through the questionnaire itself. It's voluntary, so you're not just awarded a score off the bat, but you can go through the questionnaire, submit that questionnaire, and you'll be awarded that rating. It is then up to your discretion whether or not you want to share that rating with everyone that's perhaps requesting it, but you do have a little bit more leeway in terms of how you, the timing of how you address those. So I guess just to circle back on a few of these tips, which is exactly what we're talking about here, is understanding your coverage universe. So what ratings exist and which ratings matter. If you're being ranked by a dozen different raters, not all of those are going to be necessarily important to your stakeholders. So you might need to engage some of your stakeholders to understand what they're using, what they care about. It's a great way to do perhaps a stakeholder perception study. So a customer perception study, what do they care about? What do your investors care about? And address those first. I would say the other ratings can be more on a maintenance status in some ways. So you can do incremental improvements. You can monitor them to make sure that there's not some egregious error within it, but you don't have to manage to it actively like you would the more prominent ones. And again, becoming familiar with that ratings update process, it varies by rater in terms of how often they update, how they update, and how they perform that outreach. So become familiar with that for those raters that you care about. Second column here is really getting those quick wins. I think we very often see companies that are just simply not getting credit for what they're already doing. So this has nothing to do with their ESG strategy. More often than not, it has to do with the level of disclosure. So review those ratings. If there's inconsistencies, things that just don't feel right, make sure that you're going in and making those updates, performing that outreach. Do your own disclosure and performance gap assessment. So these are terrific at finding those pockets where, what we do in fact have a code of conduct, we just simply haven't put it on the website. So identifying those gaps, but also performing those performance gaps. So as you're looking across your stakeholder list, you know that you're driving your strategy in one direction. What are the incremental activities that you can be taking to achieve those goals? So this is where that alignment really with your ESG strategy comes into play. And then finally, make sure you're just simply getting those credits. So engage, and don't worry about how often you engage with these raters. It's okay to be pesky. This is really a reflection of your brand. It's being used by investors. It's being used by customers. You want to make sure that they're right. And then finally, building the momentum. So this is where we get into the strategy components. If you're already driving your strategy, maybe it's adding a few extra KPIs to that strategy to align with the raters. So for instance, safety. Perhaps they're asking for you've been tracking a total reportable incident rate. That's the method that you've been using. But perhaps the raters are wanting to look at a lost time incidence rate. Add that one in. It doesn't take much effort. You probably already have the systems in place to calculate it, but it's going to get you that incremental improvement or that co-benefit from the rating side. Number two, making sure that you have really clear, concise messaging. I think where we run into issues with the raters is whenever you have a policy statement that doesn't match a approach that you have on your website, that doesn't match what you have in your ESG program, that doesn't match what is being spoken by many of your executives. Make sure that messaging is very conforming, make sure that it's updated regularly. And then this goes to the last piece, but make sure that those ratings updates as well as the messaging is being communicated internally. So whenever ESG sits within one individual, within one group or function within an organization, it's very siloed and you don't get the benefit of relaying that information and also receiving the feedback from others across the organization. Make sure that it's well articulated. Make sure that your management team is aware of the messaging, but also the ratings and the ratings improvements that need to happen, and particularly if there are barriers to business. So if there's minimum thresholds that are being imposed on the business, that is a direct impact on your business strategy, on your revenues. Make sure that everyone knows about it. I think that is it for me.
I think it is, and we are at 1 o'clock Eastern. So I know we have a handful of questions that came in through the Q&A, and if you are one of the people who submitted a question and we did not get to it, please rest assured that we will email you an answer, one of us. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating today and remind everyone that the slides will be available on the McGuireWoods website under events. Thank you very much.